Hey everyone. I wanted to make a little behind the scenes video about the animation I made for my Arbiter's Quest review, where I recreated the Halo 2 cutscene with the Arbiter and the Heretic Elite. There were quite a few little editing techniques and fun things that I did that I wanted to show in the hopes that you might find it helpful. Firstly, the lighting. The original scene with the Arbiter and the Heretic Elite has some really snazzy lighting, with the atmosphere of the gas giant giving anything outside a really warm orange look, whereas the inside of the station is the complete opposite, with a cool white light. To replicate this, I used my trusty little LED panel set to 5600 Kelvin, which produces a very white light, and used it to light the interior of the station I'd built. Then I lit the rest of the scene using my much bigger studio lights with softboxes. I'll link the equipment I use down in the video description if you're interested. These lights come with some coloured inserts to change their colour. They didn't have orange, which would have been a much better match to the original cutscene, but I settled for the yellow ones I did have and popped them in. I used a bit of cardboard to stop the white light from spilling over into the rest of the set. This is like a stop motion sin, but I had to move the piece of cardboard every time I needed to animate any of the figures walking past the camera, which of course if I did that wrong or if I dropped it, it might have caused some flickering on the camera. Whenever I needed a shot that showed the outside open air of the scene, I decided to use the actual softbox itself as the background so that it looked like a bright sky. Now of course, if you're filming directly into a light source, everything in front of the camera is going to be underexposed, so I had to use a lot of the other lights to brighten up all the rest of the scene. I got a lot of questions about how I made the Banshee Fly. Basically, I set up one of my lights with its softbox, and I used it as the backdrop. Then I attached two transparent pegs to the underside of the Banshee so I could turn it around easier, and filmed myself flying it around. Then in my editing software HitFilm, I found a part of the video where there's no Banshee and I took a screen grab of it. Then, in a composite shot, I brought both the video I'd shot and the screen grab of the blank background. Then I used a mask to hide my hand and the pole, and whatever's inside the mask shape shows the layer underneath, which of course is the screen grab of the blank background. With HitFilm, there's no way of automating the process, so I had to manually keyframe the whole mask so that it covered my hand and the pole for the entire time the Banshee is flying. If I'd have thought about it more, I would have filmed a version in 15 frames a second and tried out what that would have looked like. As it is, it's filmed in 30 frames a second, which makes it look quite different to the rest of the animation. I only had one Banshee model for this, but there were a few shots that needed to convey a second Banshee for the Arbiter to get into. So in this shot, I removed the Banshee's wings and held them up separately. It made it look like there was two Banshees outside. Then for the opening shot, I took two photos with the Banshee in one position and then the other, making sure to keep the camera very still in between shots. Using the same mask tool as earlier, I stitched together the images to duplicate the Banshees. This little technique is something that's surprisingly easy to do, and I've used it a lot in other stuff, like making it seem like I had 3 of these armor bays in an older animation. Now let's talk about the VFX. There's loads of plasma effects going on here. I did try shining a torch into the scene to add some practical lighting to the muzzle flashes, but because of the unusual yellow lighting, you just couldn't see it. So instead, I did pretty much everything in post-production. The plasma effects themselves are a picture from the game taken against a dark background. These aren't mine, but I can't find the original source anymore, so I don't know who to credit. Maybe at some point I'll make my own and share them around. Because the plasma bolt has a black background, you can set its transparency to screen mode, and it'll make the black transparent. I also made a copy of the plasma bolt and recoloured it to green for when I needed the carbine to fire. Then I add it to a composite shot and keyframe it to move in a line over the course of 2 or 3 frames. Then I duplicated it like a bajillion times and offset them all so they were all heading in a slightly different path to each other. In the original cutscene, there's these really cool plasma impacts on the ground, I knew I needed something like that because it just didn't look right without them. So I found a green screen video on YouTube with copyright-free cartoony effects and popped them into a composite shot. They were yellow at first, so I tinted them to become blue, shrunk them to size, and placed them where I felt the plasma was impacting. I'd have loved to add some scorch effects to the ground where they hit, but I just don't know how to do that yet. When the plasma shots went near the Banshee, I wanted to make it look like the shield was flaring, so I added a different cartoon impact that was more symmetrical, and then I also added an effect in HIT film called Shockwave, which generates an effect that expands like a shockwave. And with a little colour tweaking, it just so happens to look like a Covenant energy shield. Now I said I didn't do any practical muzzle flash lighting, but actually there was one time where the lighting was dark enough on the Banshee to be able to see it. I shone a blue torch at the Banshee every other frame when it was meant to be firing, and then in HIT film I added the plasma effects. I had to mask around the Banshee's wings so that it looked like the effect was happening behind the Banshee and not just being added on top of the footage. HIT film has a 3D perspective camera built in, so I was able to keyframe the plasma shots moving in a way that made them shrink as if they were actually moving on a 3D plane rather than just in 2D. I did use the odd Lego stud as a practical muzzle flash, but I felt I needed to go back and brighten them up because of the lack of lighting on them. To do this, I duplicated the footage that they were on, made the brightness of the duplicated footage to be insanely overexposed, and then made a little circular mask that would only show that footage where the stud was. Just trim down that overexposed footage to be a single frame wherever you want it, and bingo! It means you get a really bright area wherever you want. Lastly, I needed the Arbiter to dive out of the way of the Banshee's plasma fire. To help with this, for a few frames I used a pole attached to a stud on the floor that the Arbiter could grab and hold himself up with. I needed to get rid of this in post-production, so I used, you guessed it, the mask tool. Again, I used a shot that I'd taken of the background without him in it, and masked out the pole so he just looks like he's floating. Whenever I'm doing this, I always try to use a transparent pole in case there's part of it I can't erase. Like the fact that you can see the pole in front of his hand even after I've masked it out. If that had been coloured, you'd been able to see it, but no one's going to notice it if it's transparent. And there we are! All the little editing tricks I used in the animation. I've been a bit ill over the last couple of weeks recovering from COVID, but thankfully the symptoms were basically just a bad flu, which I'm very thankful for. It just wiped me out, so I didn't feel like working on a full video. But I hope this was interesting and helpful in some way. If you'd like to see more behind the scenes videos or have any more specific questions, then please let me know in the comments. Take care everyone.